The second lecture of this series is provided by a first-class lecturer. He is a specialist of the Bronze Age, and in particular of the Bronze Age collapse, and he is Eric Cline. He wrote a famous book about the collapse of the Bronze Age, of which a second edition is now available, and also wrote the sequel about the following period, the Iron Age, and also published a graphic novel that could be very useful for teaching purposes. We asked him for a lecture because at school we are used to studying ancient societies at the peak of their power, but societies rise and fall, ascend and collapse, and those are the moments in which they are more vulnerable. With this lecture, he provided us new information about the Bronze Age collapse and explained also the role that the climate change and the migration processes played in it.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here and to talk about one of my favorite topics. And I look forward to hearing your reactions afterward. So what we're going to do is take a look at the late Bronze Age collapse and what happened in the years after 1200 BC. I had originally published a book that many of you know about back in 2014 on this topic. But in the years afterward, so much data became available so quickly that I asked the publisher, Princeton University Press, if I could put out a revised and updated edition. And eventually they agreed. So in 2021, a new edition came out with a lot more data, all of which I hasten to add supported my original ideas, which was good news for me. So what I propose to present to you today is a combination of the original material, but with the updated material highlighted, so you can see the new data and how things have changed. But in the meantime, let me take you back to my favorite period in ancient history, namely the late Bronze Age. And if I could live in any other period apart from our own, this is when I would have wished to have lived. The number of people that I would have liked to have met, absolutely amazing, not least of which would have been somebody like Hatshepsut or Akhenaten or any of those people. But as it is, we'll just have to visit it kind of virtually today. So let me take you back to the period about 1700 to 1200 BCE. And this is the period that I refer to as the G8 or the G9, as you will, of the ancient world, because we've got the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece. We've got the Minoans on Crete. In what is today Turkey, ancient Anatolia, Asia Minor, in purple on this map are the Hittites. Then in red is a group that most people have never heard of, namely the Mitanni. And then further to the south from them in yellow on this map would be the Assyrians and the Babylonians in ancient Mesopotamia. And then, of course, we have the Egyptians, not only in Egypt, but also controlling much of Canaan, which today would be the Levant, modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, basically. And then the Cypriots on Cyprus. So this is, as I say, the G8 or the G9 of the ancient world. And everybody is interacting with everyone else. Now, a lot of people I have found out in the general world think they know nothing about this period. But in fact, as I tell my audiences, they actually know more than they think they do. And those who teach ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, ancient Rome are already quite familiar with this period. So this is when Hatshepsut, whom I just mentioned, would have ruled. This is the New Kingdom period of Egypt, basically its high point. And then Tutmosis III, her stepson and nephew, he was both, My absolute favorite person, Amenhotep III, is in this period as well, along with his son Akhenaten, the famous heretic pharaoh who may have invented monotheism. The one person I found that everybody has heard of is King Tut for some reason. So we've got him in there. And then Ramses II, who may have ruled at about the time of the biblical Exodus. But our hero today is going to be Ramses III, who you see in the lower right corner. And you will see in a moment why he is our hero. So this was a globalized society, if I can put it that way. It's not, of course, globalized today, like today, when you have an earthquake off the coast of Japan, it's reflected in the New York Stock Exchange 10 minutes later. But if we take a look at the Mediterranean from the western all the way to the eastern, this is what Susan Sherritt has called the globalized Mediterranean. And so I give you, for example, from Greece on eastward, how they were interacting at that time. But a better way to put it would be this small world network, which my wife drew for me. This is from social network analysis. And the idea is that no group is any more than 3 hops away from any other group. Over here in the US, we frequently play a game called 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, where we look at the Hollywood movies that Kevin Bacon has starred in and name his fellow actors. And you can usually get from one actor to another via a series of movies of no more than 6. Well, here we have a globalized network where nobody is more than 3 hops away. So, for example, take a look at the Mycenaeans. They were not in direct contact with the Assyrians, but you can see from this picture that the Mycenaeans are in contact with the Hittites. They are in contact with the Egyptians. They are in contact with the Babylonians, and all of them are in direct connection to the Assyrians. So the Mycenaeans are 1 or 2 hops away from the Assyrians, even though they're not directly in contact. Why do I bring this up? Because this is what is known as a small world network, and there are very few instances in human history when we've actually had a situation like this. Them back then is one of them, and us today is another, which is why I would argue that the events that took place 3,200 years ago during the collapse of the late Bronze Age may be more relevant to us today than most people think. And I will try to show that to you in the next 45 minutes or so. So we're back in the Bronze Age. Bronze, by definition, is made using usually tin and copper, 10% tin, 90% copper. If you don't have tin, you can use arsenic if you have to. I don't recommend it. You'll be dead pretty quickly, but you could use it if you need to. And the copper is not a problem. Much of it came from Cyprus during this time period. Some came from Sardinia and other areas, but the vast majority at this point in time is coming from Cyprus. The tin is a bit more problematic. There are some tin sources, of course, up in Cornwall, also in southwestern or southeastern, rather, Anatolia, modern day Turkey. But the vast majority came from off this map to the right. You can see the arrow going off. The vast majority is coming from what today we would consider Afghanistan, specifically the Badakhshan region, but also Turkmenistan and other regions in Central Asia. So we know this because we have written sources that tell us this. For example, there's one letter that was found at Mari, which is on the Euphrates River, that dates to about 1800 BCE, and it mentions that tin is coming to Mari and then going on to Ugarit on the coast of what is today North Syria, and then going from there to the Minoans on Crete. And in fact, it says that there were interpreters from Crete at Ugarit. And you'll notice in the translation that what they called Crete in Akkadian is Kaftor, and they called the Minoans Kaftorians. So we have written evidence that the 10 is coming hundreds, if not thousands, of miles. And my good friend Carol Bell, who's an archaeologist in England, she said that the importance of tin back then is probably comparable to crude oil for us today, right? Petroleum. And that they were just as worried about where tin would come from as we are concerned where oil comes from today. So that gives you some idea of the importance of tin. But they're also trading back and forth other raw materials. In addition to tin and copper, they're trading gold, they're trading silver, and they are trading finished products as well. So I give you one example. Here's another letter from Mari from the same time period, in which it says that they have sent from Crete to Mesopotamia a Kaftorian weapon. The top and the base are covered with gold. Its top is encrusted with lapis lazuli. And the picture I'm showing you is not that dagger. In fact, this is a dagger from some 700 years prior, because this is a dagger from the death pits of Ur that Sir Leonard Woolley uncovered. But it's pretty much what that dagger would have looked like. And my students know that when I retire, I want a facsimile of this as a letter opener for my retirement present. But I don't know if they've gotten the hint or not. But my favorite example from the same text is a pair of leather shoes that were in the Kaftorian style, meaning the Minoan style. And if any of you have been to Crete recently, you know that they're still famous for their leather shoes, meaning they're either sandals or boots. But these particular leather shoes were taken all the way to Mesopotamia and given to Hammurabi, the king of Babylon. And yes, that is the famous Hammurabi, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But for some reason, he didn't like the shoes and he returned them, we are told in this accounting text. And I've never known why he returned them. Did he not like them? Were they too last century? Were they out of style? And hadn't he ever heard of regifting? Right? I got these shoes from Crete. They don't fit me, but here, I think they will be perfect for you. I don't know why he didn't do that. And indeed, if you look through the law code of Hammurabi, all 272 or 282 laws, there is no penalty for returning gifts. So I leave that out there. So that's an example of what we've got. So both raw materials and finished goods. And the important thing to remember is that none of them are self-sufficient. They are all dependent on each other to some extent or another. And I give you here an example from the 15th century BC, the time of Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III, where we see people from the Aegean, Mycenaeans and Minoans, bringing gifts to Egypt. And indeed, in another of these wall paintings from the tomb of a noble from about the same time period. And you can see here the Aegean person on the right is carrying a bull's head, which is reminiscent of Crete. And in the hieroglyphics, we're given the names for them. So just as Crete was known as Kaftor in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, it's known as Keftiu. And the Keftiu is both Crete and the Minoans. And then mainland Greece, a little more problematic, but probably Tanaya is what Egypt called the Mycenaeans and the mainland Greeks. So we've got evidence for international trade there too. And we in fact have a number of shipwrecks from this time period as well, which are microcosms of what was going on at the time. And I just give you one example, the Uluburun shipwreck, which went down off the coast of what is today southwestern Turkey, ancient Anatolia, went down in about 1300 BCE, so 100 years before the collapse that is our focus today. But it had on board a cargo which had items from 7 different societies or cultures, most of the ones that I named as part of the G8 or G9. And so this, for me, is a microcosm of the globalized network of trade that was going on at the high point of the late Bronze Age. And indeed, National Geographic put together a map that you can find in the December 1987 issue, for which this is the cover story. And they put a map showing where the ship was going. It went down at the red X off of the city of Kosh, and then the blue is the route they think it took. I'm not at all sure that this is actually the route it was following. I think there's a possibility it could have been a royal gift from one king to another, but this is still a very good map because they also show where the items on board the ship would have come from. So it's very useful. And we, in fact, have a written text from the site of Ugarit on the north coast of Syria, where the Minoan interpreters had been back in 1800 BCE. We have a text from about 1260, which says that there is a merchant named Seneranu who was sending ships back and forth to Crete. And the king of Ugarit, Amastamru, says that Seneranu is exempt from taxes. His grain, his beer, his olive oil to the palace he shall not deliver. His ship is exempt when it arrives from Crete. So this may be the first example of a commercial tax exemption that we have in history. And it's from just after the time that the Ullabrun ship went down. So everything was wonderful, really wonderful from, say, 1700 to 1200 BC. Everybody is flourishing, everybody's interacting. And then all of a sudden, starting about 1200 BCE, everything comes to a screeching halt, and everything that I've just described collapses and is gone. And that network, the trading network that connected them all, vanishes within just a couple of decades. And each of the societies is affected to one degree or another. Some of them collapse completely. Others are battered but continue on. And others, like the Assyrians and the Babylonians, are almost not affected for a while, but then they too get hit as well. So basically, the late Bronze Age collapse round about the year 1200 BCE was enormous. It was, I would say it was a loss that's comparable to the fall of the Roman Empire, right? And that would have happened about 1500 years after this. So everyone knows of the fall of the Roman Empire. Very few people know about the fall of the late Bronze Age and its empires. So I have thought that that's probably a pretty good parallel to bring up here. The problem is, just as the reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire are still debated today, so we're not sure also of why the late Bronze Age collapse happened. And so what I will do is spend the rest of our time going through the various possibilities and then seeing at the end what we conclude. So originally, and back when I was a student, back in college and graduate school, I was told that a group called the Sea Peoples did it, and that they were blamed for absolutely everything. They still are part of the equation. I would not take them out, but I'm not at all sure that they are the ones that did it all unto themselves. I think they actually might be as much victims as they were aggressors, and I'll show that in a moment. But if it's not them, if it's not just the Sea Peoples, then what else could have caused it? So other scholars have suggested it might have been a drought. It might have been famine. It could have been other invaders besides the Sea Peoples, or it might have been earthquakes. And so in my book, what I do, I spend the beginning and the end talking about the collapse and the possible reasons. And I go into detail to each of these in the next to last, the penultimate chapter. having already introduced to everybody who are the Mycenaeans, who are the Minoans, who are the Hittites, who are the Egyptians, because I found again that the general public has never heard of these people. Whereas, as you now know, I think they're absolutely fascinating. So it's the very end of the book, the last couple of chapters, where I go through the hard data for all of these possibilities. And I found myself unable to decide whether I liked one or another better. So I chose them all. And I actually concluded that it was a perfect storm of catastrophes. And my thinking is very simple, that a society, a civilization, if it gets hit by a drought, can be hugely impacted, but it usually won't collapse totally. Same thing with famine. A lot of people will die, the society will be impacted, but usually a society won't disappear completely. Same thing with invaders, same thing with earthquakes. But what if you have more than one? What if you have two of these? What if you have three of these, or even four of these, all happening at about the same time or in quick succession, such that you do not have time to recover from one before the next one hits? So if you're suffering from a drought and therefore you have famine, and then on top of that, invaders show up or you get hit with an earthquake, at some point you're going to say enough, and your society is going to take a tumble. So I concluded that it was a perfect storm of catastrophes. And fortunately, from my point of view, all of the data that's been appearing since 2014 corroborate this suggestion. The one thing that I think is now clear is that climate change was much more important than I had been willing to admit. In the 2014 book, I was attempting to be very even-handed and said, I don't know which one is more important. Now, as you will see, I'll show you the data, I think there's no way to get around the fact that the climate change was probably, it's not the main driver, but it is one of the most important. And I think from the climate change, we get the drought, and from the drought, we get the famine, and perhaps from the famine, we get the invaders. Of course, you're not going to get earthquakes, but I think pretty much everything else is linked. So let me run through these fairly quickly, knowing that our time is limited today, and start with the sea peoples. And what I had said previously in my original book in 2014, I had gone through the evidence for the sea peoples. And mind you, that's our name for them. That's actually what they were called originally in French, and now in English we call them the Sea Peoples. They came twice. They invaded and attacked Egypt twice, once in 1207 and once in 1177. And of course, those are our years. And since Egyptian chronology can be a bit slippery, probably a better way to put it to everyone is they came in the 5th year of Merneptah and then the 8th year of Ramses III. That would be more accurate, but it doesn't fit as well on the cover of the book as the title, as my editor told me. So let me just take the second instance where the title comes from. Ramses III, his year 8, he tells us on the wall of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, which is down in Luxor near the Valley of the Kings and King Tut's tomb. He says the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. And then he tells us the route that these sea peoples were taking. He says nobody could stand in front of them from Hate, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on. So we know where these are. Hate, those are the Hittites in ancient Anatolia, the people that were in purple on the first map. Kode and Carchemish, in today's terms, it's where Turkey meets Syria. Arzawa, or Arzawa, is on the western coast of Anatolia. Alashia, that's the Bronze Age name for Cyprus. So we can see that these sea peoples are basically coming from west to east. And then they settled down for a time in Amur, which is just to the south of Ugarit in North Syria. And eventually then, towards the end of this inscription, he tells us actually who they are. Their confederation was the Peleset, the Tajeker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. So they didn't call them the Sea Peoples. They actually gave us the individual names. And he says then, in a slightly later inscription, that he defeated them. Right? He overthrew those who invaded from their lands. He slew the Denyen who were in their isles. The Tajeker and the Peleset were made ashes. The Shardana and the Weshesh of the sea, they were made as those that exist not. So the big question is, who actually are these people? Where do they come from? Where do they go to? So we've been playing linguistic games for the last 100 years or so. And one of the things that we've been doing is taking these ancient names and saying, well, what modern names sound similar? And so I ask my audiences, Shardana, name me a place in the Mediterranean that has the same consonants, and they will eventually come up with Sardinia. And indeed, that seems to be the best guess so far. Same thing with the Shekelesh. If you just look at the consonants, Sicily is most likely there. But one of the questions is, do they come from those regions? Do they come from the Western Mediterranean? Or do they go there afterward? And the original Egyptologists thought that they went there afterward, after the collapse, after they're defeated by the Egyptians, and they settled down in Sardinia and Sicily. But Ramses says that when he beats them, he settles them in strongholds bound in my name. That would be in Egypt and in Canaan. So the thinking has now shifted, and I agree with the shift. I think they are coming from the Western Mediterranean. They're coming from places like Sardinia and Sicily and ending up in the Eastern Mediterranean. The problem with that, even though, of course, we've got people in Bronze Age, Sardinia and Sicily, we don't actually have any place that we can point to where we say, that's the homeland of the Sea Peoples. And eventually, if somebody were to give me $1 million, I would love to come and excavate Sardinia, Sicily, somewhere, see if we can find the origins of the Sea Peoples. The others are most of them more problematic, except for the very last. The Tajeker, we're not quite sure where they come from. Maybe from somewhere in the Troad. Many people think the Denyans may be Homer's Mycenaeans, the Danaans, or the Danaioi. The Weshesh, perhaps also from the area of Troy, which the Hittites called Wilusa. So you can see Weshesh is similar. The one that we're quite sure of are the Peleset, and these are what we would now today call the Philistines. And indeed, Champollion, Jean-Francois Champollion, who deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics, he had already decided that the Peleset were probably the Philistines. But as I say, this is all just a guess. We're not sure at all if we are correct. And moreover, keep in mind that this is not a bunch of warriors out raiding. This is a migration. These are families that are migrating. And we can see elsewhere on that Medinet Habu inscription, Ramses III includes pictures. And so you can see on the left, probably better in the top right with the artist's rendition, that we've got not just the warriors, but their families, the wives, the kids, the ox carts, the Samsonite tourist luggage. And so I would say that a parallel to today could either be the Dust Bowl in the United States in the 1930s, where people moved from Oklahoma to California because of the drought, or today, probably an even better analogy would be the Syrian refugees who are fleeing the civil war in Syria, but also the migrants that are coming from Africa up to Italy and Europe and other places. So just as we have migrants and people fleeing situations today, I think that's the Sea Peoples. And so you can see why I would argue that they're as much victims back then as they might be oppressors. They're people fleeing from a drought, from whatever, and trying to find a better place to live. And I think that was true back in about 1200 BC. Now, there is some additional data, and I just give you the most important. There was a cemetery excavated at Ashkelon a couple of years ago in what is now southern Israel, and they actually found a Philistine cemetery, and as well underneath a couple of houses, they found some infant burials, and they tested them for DNA. Now, the infant burials are not sea peoples. They're from later that century, about 75 or 100 years later. But the DNA says that they're of mixed origin, that part of it are local Canaanites and part is other. And when they ran the computer models to try to figure out where the other was, the most likely scenario is Crete, Sicily, or Spain. And so these kids, who are probably the grandkids of the sea peoples, of the Philistines, definitely show that the Philistines came, settled down in Canaan, what is now southern Israel, and mingled with the local Canaanites. So it looks like it was a much more peaceful assimilation, if you will. And so this DNA evidence is really important. And it was published open access back in July 2019. So that's kind of exciting. Okay, in terms of drought, let me run through the evidence for the other things, and then, and then see what conclusions we come to. The idea that drought was a factor is not new. In fact, all the way back in 1966, Rhys Carpenter at Bryn Mawr College had already suggested that there was a drought in Greece, and that had ended the Mycenaean civilizations. But he didn't have the hard data for it. He had some data about population migration. He had some data about population decline, but he really didn't have the hard data. And so over time, his idea was almost forgotten, to be perfectly honest. But now, today, we have the data that he was looking for. And it starts with David Kanievsky and his team out of France, who in 2010 went to a site called Tel Twaini, ancient Gibala, which is just to the south of Ugarit in North Syria. And they published the results the following year in 2011. What they did very simply was to take a coring sample. They did a core down through dried up lakes in this region, dried up rivers, 20 feet, 30 feet. They drilled down and they brought up a dirt core and they cut it into sections. And then under a microscope, they looked at the ancient pollen that was contained in that river and lake sediment. And what they were able to show is that the pollen changes, the plants change. They become more hardy and can thrive in an arid environment without as much water. And so they concluded that there was what they called a dry event. In plain words, it's a drought. But it's not just any drought, it's a mega drought, because it lasts, they said, for up to 300 years, from about 1200 down to about 900 BCE. And so then they took their show on the road, basically, and they moved from Tel Twaini, Syria, over to Cyprus, just directly across, and they went to Hala Sultan Teke, which was a famous Bronze Age international port, thriving at about this time. It has a dried up lagoon next to the site, and they took coring samples there as well. You can see in the lower left the core and then chunks of it there. And again, they looked at the pollen under a microscope, and once again found that the environment had become much more arid, much more drier, with precipitation becoming insufficient. And so they came up with evidence for a drought during the same period on Cyprus. Other people took up the challenge, and one group with Daphne Langut, you can see Daphne in the lower right there, along with Israel Finkelstein and Thomas Litt from Germany, they did the same thing. They took coring samples, but this time from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, as well as from the western shore of the Dead Sea, and found that there had been a drought there also. Maybe not as long lasting, maybe only about 150 years from 1250 to 1100, but a drought there nonetheless. Other people jumped in with other studies at that point, and a friend of mine, Lee Drake, published a comprehensive survey in 2012 in the Journal of Archaeological Science, pulling together a lot of the investigations that had been done up until that time, and concluding that Greece was also suffering from a drought at that same time, starting in about 1250 BCE. And then there's been a lot of additional data, a lot. Some of it new and some that I had not considered in the original book. For instance, here, there had been a study published in 2012 that I had not included in the first edition, but is now in the revised edition. A similar study, coring done in the Nile Delta region of Egypt, and they also found evidence for a drought that starts in about 1200 BCE because of a lack of rainfall up in Ethiopia, which resulted in a reduced flow of the Nile and drought in Egypt. And then another team investigated also in Egypt in 2015, after my book had come out, and found the same thing, a 200-year-long drought on either side of 1000 BC, so starting at about 1200. So obviously there's a drought in Egypt as well. And then Kanievsky went back in 2014 to Haifa, found that there had been a change in the surface temperature of the sea, as well as a change in the environment. And what had been a forest went to thorny shrubs and then just to open steppe. And it didn't begin to recover. You don't get trees there until about 850. So again, drought down in the area of what is now modern Haifa. Other studies have done other types of research besides coring. So here, Martin Finet and Erika Weiberg from Uppsala, they went to Greece and they went to a cave called Mavri Tripa, which is way down south by the palace of Nestor and Pylos. And in that cave, they investigated one of the stalagmites. They called it S1. You can see in the lower right, the rings that they were looking at, the actual pictures on the top left. And what they found was that water decreased there as well, such that by about 900 BCE, the stalagmite simply stopped growing because there wasn't any water. So this is another inference that there is a drought in Greece at that time. And very recently, Christian Christensen in 2018 published a synthesis of other studies as well, and concluded that northern Italy was suffering from a drought in about 1200 BCE also, and that there is evidence that there was a massive migration, perhaps of up to 120,000 people who left at that time. And it may be, since they headed south and west towards southern Italy and Sicily, and then eventually to the Aegean and beyond, it may be that this newest evidence for drought in northern Italy could be the origins of the Sea Peoples. So that is some of the newest evidence that we've got, and among the most exciting, I think. So it may be that we will find the origins of the Sea Peoples also. And it also does get an explanation for why they started moving if there were a drought back in their homelands. In that case, though, they were literally out of the frying pan and into the fire, as the saying goes, because there was also a drought, of course, in the Eastern Mediterranean, but they would probably not have known that at the time they started migrating. And then the most recent finding, just from the middle of March of this year, actually the day before the Ides of March, it was the 14th of March, they found evidence for a drought in Anatolia in the Hittite lands from the tomb at Gordian. So we're still getting more and more information. And I just give you this one map as a summation here. Everywhere you see a red dot is evidence for drought back then, between 1200 and 900 BCE. And it comes from a variety of places, lakes, lagoons, caves, and so on. And it basically now spreads from Italy on one side all the way over to Iran on the other. So definitely our entire area that we're talking about is impacted by drought at that time. And I do think that leads to famine, as is often the case. Famine can be very hard to find in the archaeological record unless you have written evidence for it. And fortunately, we do. And in my 2014 edition, I had talked a fair amount about these texts from Ugarit. Remember the merchant Sinaranu, who was sending his ship to Crete. There are archives at Ugarit, modern Ras Shamra, that belong to at least 3 private merchants, but also the palace. And in these archives, it mentions famine. Here is one letter from a merchant named Bania sent to his boss, Ortenu. Ortenu is based in Ugarit. Bania is in a branch office in Emar, in inland Syria, where they're suffering from famine. And he says, "There's famine in our house. We will all die of hunger. So please come quickly." We similarly have other texts written by the Hittites, by the kings and the queen up there. "Do you not know there was famine in the midst of my lands? Here with me, plenty has become famine. It's a matter of life and death." So we know that there is famine up in Anatolia as well. But this is where it gets really interesting, because some of the new data, which has appeared since 2016, and this is really the reason I wanted to revise the book. The excavators at Ugarit published in French in 2016 some of the texts that had been dug up quite a bit earlier. And then Yori Cohen, a friend of mine, and a Syriologist, translated these and published them in English in 2021. And so, for instance, in these new texts, one of them is a letter from Seti II, the Pharaoh of Egypt, writing to the king of Ugarit. And he says, he quotes a letter that the king of Ugarit had previously sent to Egypt. He says, "You had written to me, in the land of Ugarit there is severe hunger. May my Lord save the land of Ugarit, and may the king give grain to save my life and to save the citizens of the land of Ugarit." So this is the king of Ugarit saying, "There's famine in my city," writing to the Egyptians, basically, "help us." And we do know that in this letter from Seti II, he says, "I'm sending you 7,000 dried fish," which hopefully would have helped the famine. And he also sends textiles and colorful beads, like for necklaces. I don't know why the textiles and the beads were sent, but the fish, I can see they would have helped. So we have other ones as well that were just published. Here is from somebody in Ugarit writing to the king. "Grain staples from you are not to be had. The people will all die of hunger. Give us grain staples." So again, we know there is famine in Ugarit itself. And we also know from other scientific studies that have been done that the Egyptians tried to do something about it. This is a scientific study that was done by Israel Finkelstein and his team. And they found evidence of 2 things. One, that the Egyptians had been planting more grain in Canaan, the land that was under their control, and they had been crossbreeding their cattle, taking their normal cattle and crossbreeding with zebu or zebu cattle, in English Zebu, which are much more hardy and much more resistant to drought. So they have been trying to crossbreed their cattle to make them more resistant. So whether or not it worked is up to debate. So that's the evidence that we've got for famine. The evidence for invaders, I've already gone through the Egyptian evidence for the Sea Peoples, but we have other evidence as well, again from Ugarit. There is a text, very famous, that says, "My father, now the ships of the enemy have come. They've been setting fire to my cities and have done harm to the land." The problem is the author does not say who the enemy is. So we're not sure if it's sea peoples or someone else, but he says that there are 7 ships and they have done harm, and he is asking the king of Cyprus to let him know if there are other enemy ships as well. And in fact, the governor of Cyprus writes back and says, yeah, there's 20 more ships that we have seen, but we don't know where they went. We don't know if they're heading towards you or somewhere else. And we also get a letter from somebody in Carchemish to the king of Ugarit, who says the king of Carchemish is on his way. He's sending reinforcements. So just hold on until they get there. Now, the new data that has come out since 2014, we have another one of these letters that was published in French in 2016 and then in English in 2021. And again, Yori Cohen has translated this. It is a letter from the very last king of Ugarit, a guy named Amarapi, not Hammurabi, but Amarapi, sending it to the viceroy at Carchemish. And he says, I wrote to you 2 times, 3 times, news about the enemy. And then he says, importantly, may my lord know that the enemy forces are at Rashu. That is modern Ras Ibn Hani, which is the 2nd port city of Ugarit, right on the coast. And he says, enemy forces are stationed at Rashu, and their avant-garde forces have been sent to Ugarit. So in other words, the enemy is advancing on Ugarit. And he says to the leader at Carchemish, send me forces, send me chariots, and save me from the forces of this enemy. And you'll remember the other letter where they said, we're sending you reinforcements, try and hold on. But it was too late. The excavators of Ugarit found a destruction layer 1 meter deep of ashes and fallen timbers and fallen walls, arrowheads in the streets, hordes of metal buried. It's very obvious that Ugarit fell to humans, fell to invaders, and in fact, this city is abandoned for the next 400 years. Nobody lives there. Nobody comes back for the stuff that they had buried. And indeed, one of the last letters that is at Ugarit is from somebody reporting that their army had already been defeated and the city was sacked, and that their food was burnt. Our city is sacked. May you know it. May you know it. So we have evidence for invaders. The problem is, in all of them, including the recent ones, it just says the enemy. It doesn't tell us who the enemy is. So it may have been the Sea Peoples. It may have been somebody else. Evidence for earthquakes, though, I bring up because it can be hard to tell when you're digging a destruction of a city, like at Ugarit. It can be hard to tell if it is because of human invaders or if it is because of Mother Nature, that is perhaps an earthquake. And so previously, what I had pointed out in the first edition of the book, here is a map of most of the sites that are destroyed during the late Bronze Age collapse. Every red X is a destroyed city. And if you take a look at a map of all the earthquakes that have happened just in the last 100 years or so, you can see that our entire area is an active seismic zone. And you remember the big earthquake that hit in northern Syria and southeastern Turkey, February of last. So not surprising. I would say quite a number of these cities are probably destroyed by earthquake rather than by humans. And indeed, if you look at the fault lines that are there, you've got in light blue the North Anatolian fault line, and in green coming down next to Greece, and then orange coming up the Rift Valley. And the thing about the earthquakes is there is something called an earthquake sequence by modern seismologists, which archaeoseismologists, people who study earthquakes in antiquity, call an earthquake storm. If you have one earthquake and it does not release the pressure, all of the pressure in the fault, you will have another earthquake soon thereafter, days after, weeks after, maybe months after. If that earthquake doesn't release the rest of the pressure, you'll have another and another and another. And what happens is your fault line basically unzips. It can take up to 60 years for that to happen and to get rid of all the pressure. And then it builds up again, probably for another 300 or 400 years. And so what it looks like we have is one of these earthquake storms or sequences that goes for about 50 years, from 1225 to 1175. And so I think we have to add that in to the problems at this time. And so, for instance, I show you on the left here, both top and bottom, earthquake evidence at Mycenae on mainland Greece. And the lower left, you can see a skeleton of a young woman who was killed by a stone falling when she sheltered in the doorway of her house, and it collapsed around her. Above it, the upper left, this is one of the famous pictures of Mycenae with the lion gate and everything. What most people don't realize is that the big wall on the left, the Cyclopean masonry wall, is built directly on a seismic fault line. That bedrock that the wall is on is actually one half of a seismic fault. And yes, Mycenae is built directly on top of an earthquake zone. Top right, Troy. Troy 6 is also destroyed by an earthquake, and you can see the wall tilting there. Trust me, it didn't look like that in antiquity. That's what happens when you have an earthquake. And down bottom at Ugarit, there is an earlier earthquake from about the middle of the 14th century, and you can see how the wall twists and turns there. So definitely earthquakes at this time. And in fact, there has been additional data found, for instance, at 4 sites which seem to have all been impacted by the same earthquake. We've got Deir Allah, Umairi, and Sayediya, all in what is today Jordan, plus Bet Shan in what is today Israel. And then it looks like another earthquake, perhaps one of these part of the storm at Azekah in southern Israel. And you're seeing a picture of the destruction from there. That's being excavated right now. Some more details are coming up. So I think we have to add earthquakes in there as well. And then last but not least, disease. We don't actually have any archaeological evidence for this per se, as it were, but we do have textual evidence for a plague slightly earlier, the plague prayers of Mercilius II. He writes about a plague that was brought from Egyptian prisoners of war and killed Shupilululiuma I, the king of the Hittites, and many others in his royal family, as in addition to thousands of others across the Hittite Empire. So this is a little over 100 years before the collapse that we're talking about, but it does show that you could have plague at that time as well. And in fact, we know that Ramses V, who rules in about 1140, he did have smallpox. You can see his mummy here, and if you look clearly, you can see the smallpox pustules on his face. And a related discussion in a papyrus, which is now in Turin, says that he and others were not buried for 16 months after they died, which is, of course, much longer than the usual amount of time, and that new tombs were dug for them, and the men who dug the tombs and who buried them were then given a month's leave at the expense of the pharaoh, and the Valley of the Kings was closed for 6 months. So this might have been the world's first known quarantine. So that may be some indication that smallpox or some other plague was part of this as well. And indeed, if you're familiar with the story in Book 1 of the Iliad, the Mycenaeans are ravaged by plague. And of course, during the biblical Exodus, you've got the 10 plagues as well. So those might be memories of disease at that time as well. And of course, all of this would have gone hand in hand with the cutting of the trade routes, right? Any of these disruptions. And remember, most of the tin is coming all the way from basically Afghanistan. And so if you can't get tin, then you can't make bronze, and then you are in real trouble. So I think that is part of this as well. So having presented all of that, what I would conclude is that hopefully you are now aware of why I argued that there wasn't a single driving force, and there wasn't one thing that you can point to, oh, that did it, oh, it was the sea peoples, but that there were a number of different stressors. But the new data, to me, has shown that I do think climate change is the most important one, that's the primary one, but it's not the only one. And what we've got then, if you have a number of these happening in rapid succession, that you're going to have a domino effect and also a multiplier effect. That is, the effects will be multiplied. They will be much more catastrophic. And then when one goes down, when one society collapses, the others will be affected and will follow suit to a certain degree, because remember, they are not self-sufficient. They are dependent on each other. And if suddenly you can't get copper from Cyprus, for example, then that's going to affect the Mycenaeans. If you can't get gold from Egypt, that's going to affect everybody. So I think you've got both. But overall, also what I think we're doing is we're looking at a systems collapse. And this is what Colin Renfrew defined back in the late 70s. This is when your central administration collapses. This is when your centralized economy collapses. It's when your traditional elites, the 1%, they disappear. And this is when your population declines and those who survive migrate and move away. And one thing that Renfrew said is that a systems collapse can take up to a century to happen, and that there's usually no one single obvious cause. And I think we've got that. And so, in fact, the title of my book, 1177, The Year That Civilization Collapsed, is a misnomer. And I fought my editor for the entire time I was writing the book. I said, that's not the year it collapsed. That's the year that the Sea Peoples invaded for the second time. And he said, okay, well, what should be the title? I said, life in 1200 was very different from life in 1100 and extremely different from 1000 BC. And he said that may be true, but it's not going to fit on the cover of your book. So he made me call it 1177. But in the book, I explain that for me, it's shorthand. And so at least here in the United States, when we're teaching ancient history to like 6th graders and 10th graders in high school, and we're talking, for example, about the fall of the Roman Empire, frequently we'll say it happened in 476, knowing full well that it did not, knowing full well that it took most of the 5th century AD. But it's shorthand. And for the school kids to remember it, we say, look, it fell in 476. So for me, 1177 is to the late Bronze Age collapse as 476 is to the fall of the Roman Empire. That's not when it happened, but it was during that century. And so we can get, especially, the high school kids who are younger, to remember that date. And importantly for us too, in the aftermath of that kind of a collapse, when things go down to a lower level temporarily, we also get myths about what collapsed. So think Homer, think Iliad, think Odyssey, and the story of the Trojan War. And I think that fits very well. So let me wrap up with what lessons, if any, can we learn from all of this? Are we currently facing a similar situation to what they faced at the time of the late Bronze Age collapse in 1177? And I would say, yes, absolutely. We've got climate change today, no doubt about it. We have famines and droughts. We have earthquakes. We have rebellions. And we have migrants and refugees who are fleeing both war and drought. So I do think that we are facing a very similar situation today that they faced back in the late Bronze Age. But I remain with some unanswered questions from back then. For example, did they know that they were actually collapsing, right? Did the Mycenaeans know they were collapsing? Did the Hittites know? We don't know. They don't tell us. They didn't leave any records. And we don't know if anybody was aware that the whole thing was collapsing, the larger globalized trade network. We don't have any implication that they know that. And even if they did know, could they have done anything to stop it or even to slow it down? And again, we don't have an answer for that. We do know that, like, the Egyptians were trying to counteract the effect of the famine with crossbreeding of cattle and crops in Levant, but apparently it was for naught. Now, what happened afterward? I will end with this because I have just written the sequel to this book. It's called, as you might imagine, After 1177 BC. And I look at the next 400 years from 1200 to 800, or rather 1176 to 776. I end with the traditional date for the first Olympic Games. And I look at the 8 case studies that we have. What do you do after a collapse? How do you come back, or do you come back? And what I found, perhaps not surprisingly, is that everybody reacted differently. Some did not transform and disappeared. Others were able to cope. Others were able to adapt. Others were able to transform. So, like the Mycenaeans and Minoans and the Hittites, they disappeared completely. Nobody called themselves a Mycenaean or a Minoan or a Hittite per se afterward. Even the Canaanites in southern Canaan disappeared. And that's when we get new things coming in. We get the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah, the Philistines. We get the Neo-Hittites in northern Syria. We get the Urartians in Anatolia. The Assyrians and the Babylonians did actually quite well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture. I think because they're so far inland and because they're on the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, but even they are affected. Of them all, the 2 groups that do the best, one are the Cypriots on Cyprus. They seem to be the ones that transition to iron the fastest, the first, and the other are the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians are basically anti-fragile. They flourish in the time of chaos. They take advantage of the fact that Ugarit was sacked, and they take over the trade routes to the Aegean and Western Mediterranean. And while they're bringing purple dye, they're also bringing the alphabet. And so from the Phoenicians, we get what becomes the Latin alphabet, which in Italy, which becomes what today we use to write English and French and German and Italian and all of that, but also becomes the Greek alphabet in Greece. So the Phoenicians and the Cypriots probably do the best, as I will discuss in that sequel, which will come out in April of 2024. But I did have an interview on NPR with Adam Frank after the first book came out, and I said very blithely, we're going to be okay. Unlike the Hittites who didn't know what was happening, we are now advanced enough to know what's happening, and we can take steps to fix things like climate change. And Adam said to me, maybe, but are we advanced enough to do anything with our understanding? And I would say that it remains to be seen whether we have a good answer to Adam's question. And I would remind you that Mark Twain once said, history might not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I, for one, am wondering if history is rhyming right today. And with that, I thank you for your attention and will be happy to take any questions. Thanks.